By July of 1742, James Oglethorpe had 900 men in 2 forts here on St. Simon's Island, which he viewed as a primary target of a possible Spanish invasion. And believing that they would outnumber him, he sent word up to Savannah requesting help from any Indian allies, Rangers, and Highlanders to make their way down to the Georgia coast and fend off the Spanish Empire. Sure enough, just a few days later, on July 5th, the governor of La Florida, when 36 ships made their way up to the southern end of the island and began shelling Fort St. Simon's. Now, this went on for 6 hours before the Spaniards realized that there would be no way for them to actually make port at that fort, so they continued up around the coast and made port right here behind me at Gascoigne Bluff. 2,000 men, the entire garrison of Fort St. Augustine, which was shelled by Oglethorpe a little while previously, and all the men from Fort Mose, which was a black fort of freed slaves. It was a maroon community that was allied with the Spanish because if you could escape from the plantations in Georgia, they would give you your freedom after military service. So naturally, a lot of these people had a vested interest on the Spanish side of seeing this battle victorious. And had they won, Georgia would have been part of Florida, would have been part of Spain. And along with those 2,000 men were also grenadiers from Havana, Cuba. Now, for the day, they realized it was getting a little bit late in the night, and they would set up camp along this bluff and wait for the morning of the 6th, where they began their march down to St. Simon's Fort. Keep in mind here, Oglethorpe only had 900 men, and he was more than doubly outnumbered by the Spaniards, so he quickly retreated from Fort St. Simon to Fort Frederica that night. And as the Spanish advanced on it on the morning of the 6th, they found that all of the guns had been spiked, which basically amounts to driving a metal wedge into the powder receptacle so they're unusable. All of the powder has been taken and moved along the old wagon road up to Fort Frederica, and Montiano decides to send out an advanced party of searchers to the fort on the northern end of the island and see if they can't defeat it. But they were stopped about halfway north by a band of Indians with their war cries just on the outskirts of Fort Frederica, allies of James Oglethorpe.
Not to mention your lock, stock, and barrel, right? So now, obviously, again, I can't demonstrate this indoors, but if you have any questions about it, it's very easy. 60 caliber, 20 gauge smoothbore. And created by built by myself, inlaid beads, the whole 9 yards. So this is a pretty cool gun.
And the Battle of Gully Hole Creek would have taken place about a quarter mile south of here. The fort itself being back here, if you can see it. That was shelled on July 11th, but it's kind of interesting to think that the Indians likely saw the Spanish advance, about 400 of them along with some Highlanders, and started charging them after a war cry from this town wall.
So at the battles of Gully Hole Creek and the Battle of Bloody Marsh, there were actually 3 different kinds of British soldiers that were here. The first were the British regulars, which was the 42nd Regiment of Foot. Or I should say 4 different kinds. There was the 42nd Regiment of Foot, which was a British regular army unit, dressed in red coats, kind of as you would expect a regular British infantry unit to look. There were Indian allies, primarily Muskogean people, the Yamacraw and the Yamasee, that they would have been fighting for the British as well. There was Anglo militia, so Englishmen or English-speaking militia that would have come down.
Just regular people from the town.
Regular people from the town, tradespeople, farmers, things of that nature, who would have been expected to give military service. Then the last group were folks that looked a lot like me, which were Scottish Highlanders. And these guys were actually primarily Gaelic speaking. They didn't speak English. Only about 2 or 3 of them, when they arrived in Georgia, were English speaking. Most of them spoke Scots Gaelic, Celtic language, and they would have been dressed and armed pretty similar to how I appear. So they would have been wearing a great kilt, which is just a giant blanket that's ultimately just belted onto the body. So there's no,
Oh, wow.
there's no seams, no stitching, no buttons or buckles. It's just a blanket that you kind of roll up and belt on, and then pin or button to your shoulder. And then they would have worn a short coat and sewn hose. These are not knitted socks. These are actually a piece of tartan fabric like the coat, and stitched up the back. And so we know that the Highlanders that were here in Georgia were provided with fabrics for the great kilt and the short hose and short coat. They were ordered in Scotland when the Highlanders were being recruited. And we also know that they were issued weapons, a broadsword like this, as well as a musket. This is a British Brown Bess musket. It's a 75 caliber weapon that typically would have fired a 68 caliber ball. And the reason it's a slightly smaller ball is it makes it easier to actually ram that charge into the barrel when you're trying to fight in a line. And so this is a flintlock weapon. This piece of flint here strikes the steel frizzen, which would flip open. You'd have powder inside of a priming pan here. You can see there's a really small hole called the touch hole, and that is where your charge would ignite in the pan and hopefully light the charge that was rammed down into the barrel. So you'd have powder and then some sort of a wadding, typically a paper cartridge, and then a musket ball that would go on top of that. And that whole charge would be muzzle loaded with the ramrod.
Hardly had the Spaniards had any time to actually set up at Fort St. Simons than Montiano ordered 100 of them to advance north on Oglethorpe's position in Fort Frederica. And as they approached within about a quarter mile of the fort, they heard the yells, the war cries of about 100 Indians allied with Oglethorpe. And believing themselves to be outnumbered, they headed south. Now, this was a force of about 400 Indians, along with a couple Highlanders and James Oglethorpe himself, versus the Spaniards. And what followed was the Battle of Gully Hole Creek. Now, the Spaniards left, and they retreated about 2 miles before they lost the force under Oglethorpe. And Oglethorpe, at this point in time, actually went back, and little known to the Spaniards, when they made camp near Bloody Marsh, the aptly named, was that the Indians did not fall back with Oglethorpe. They kind of settled into the swamp and waited for nightfall as the Spaniards set up camp and waited for a supplying party from Fort St. Simons to come up and sleep with them, because they were trying to occupy various parts of the island at that time. And what followed at daybreak the next morning was the Battle of Bloody Marsh, probably one of the most forgotten battles in Georgia history, and one of the most one-sided, if some of the claims are to be believed. In the aftermath of their brutal loss at the Battle of Gully Creek, Spanish sounded retreat and made their way to occupied Fort St. Simons. And on their way down, they decided that they would set up camp along the old wagon road because they had seen the Indians making their way back up to Frederica. However, unbeknownst to them, the Indians flanked them and saw them set up camp. And even though Spaniards were coming in throughout the night to reinforce them and nurse their wounded, as the sun rose on the morning of the 7th, they heard a volley of gunfire ringing out from the underbrush and cutting down dozens of men instantly. And over the next couple of minutes, 200 Spaniards would be slaughtered in the Bloody Marsh. And immediately, any Spaniards who survived desperately attempted to reform their ranks and launch a charge, but anyone who had any sense ran off into the marshland and tried to make their way back to St. Simon Fort. And the Spanish there had a suffering blow to their morale. And over the next few days, a stalemate would follow until the 11th, which is when the governor of La Florida decided to launch one last attack with 1 galleon and 2 boats up to Fort Frederica, which was totally unsuccessful.
And so the idea was you wanted to get as many people together as you could, firing these all at once to create a volley, and that gives you basically a wall of lead. Most of these battles are starting at about 300 yards out. You're firing a volley or two. You're slowly advancing, trying to, whittle down the other side, trying to, maneuver on the field. And then ultimately, when you feel like you have the advantage, you switch to a bayonet or some other kind of close quarters weapon to charge and basically take the field. Highlanders didn't really like to fight like that. They were sort of opposed to the idea of standing and waiting for people to shoot at them. So oftentimes they would only get within 100 to 150 yards, fire 1 or 2 shots, throw their muskets down, grab their swords, pull their dirk, take their targe, which is their shield, and execute what's called a Highland charge, and that was their preferred method of attack.
And would that have happened at Gully Creek?
It did happen at Gully Hole Creek. We know that that's exactly what essentially broke the Spanish as they were marching in. They were coming up a military road. It was sort of a movement to contact. They didn't know who was there, and essentially there was a couple rounds fired. The Scots took the advantage, charged. The Spaniards were, understandably freaked out, and they basically took off running. They regrouped, and then they continued their march on to Frederica. But that also afforded the entire British group that was here time to likewise regroup and set up an ambush for later in the day as the Spanish got closer to the fort.
And that was so. What happened at Bloody Marsh? That seemed like a much more brutal battle.
Yeah, well, actually, there were more casualties at Gully Hole Creek. Believe it or not, Bloody Marsh just sounds a lot more intense. But Bloody Marsh, the reason why it was, it was a much more decisive battle was because it was a design battle. So the Highlanders actually had time to set up an ambush, and they likewise executed a charge at Bloody Marsh as well. So as the Spaniards were coming down the road, they were able to fire more shots. They were able to, kind of further scare them, draw their swords and charge there as well.
And after 2 disastrous battles at Gully Hole Creek and Bloody Marsh, the Spanish under Montano decided to sail up here with just a few boats, thinking that they'd be able to shell the small fort. But to their surprise, Oglethorpe started shelling them back, and they quickly retreated again back to Fort St. Simon's, and this was on July 11th. Much like Fort St. Augustine, which was shelled by Oglethorpe a few years prior, this fort, Frederica, was built of the same shell concrete material. And you could see what a firm structure it would have been. Right here, you could have taken cover from the Spanish shelling from men under Montano, and the fort itself was a fortified community. This was actually one of the most fortified places in the New World, stretching all out behind me to the north of the island of St. Simon's. So this is old Fort Frederica, and we're actually in the visitor center right here, and you can still see the old walls around here. And I wanted to show you one of the Gully burial sites. They had a slave burial just about 100 feet to the left here, and the only part that's left, you can still see some of the foundations of the tabby shells, but this is kind of the redoubt. And the only thing that's left is actually the white building that looks like a castle right there. And that is what shelled the governor of La Florida when he moved in. And he was very surprised that they were shelling him back from a building that small, so he left back to Fort St. Simon's. And in a series of events that's almost unbelievable, the Spanish finally left Georgia not too long after this. It started with an Englishman who was French by birth but in Oglethorpe's army who tried defecting over to the Spaniards. In reality, he was probably a Frenchman and believed in the territorial sovereignty of Spain over Georgia, so he decided to go and join their forces. Well, Oglethorpe discovered this, and so he sent drummers out into the forest to beat a tune, which made the Spaniards think they had a much larger force, so they retreated. And in the disarray, Oglethorpe sent a couple of Indians to deliver him a letter. Now this letter said, hey, we know that you're spying for us, good job, Frenchman, so all you gotta do is collect a couple more movements on the Spaniards and bring that back to us and we'll give you a medal or something. So the Spanish actually discovered the Frenchman with this note, and the Frenchman, in spite of all of his pleading, saying, I really do support you guys, was executed by the Spanish military. And after their total defeat at the shelling of Fort Frederica, when they didn't realize Oglethorpe was going to shell them back, there was rapid dissension within their ranks. Even the men who were freed slaves from Fort Mose said, we really don't belong here. We should head back. We're outnumbered. And when ships arrived on the horizon, they were only British merchant ships, but the Spaniards thought that these ships actually were reinforcements from Savannah. So they left back to Florida and never really launched a mainstream invasion again, although, as I've mentioned elsewhere in this video, they kind of sent different raiding parties to destabilize Georgia, mainly through their use of Native American tribes. And just take a look at some of the fortifications that remain around this old fort from the early 1700s. From the air, you must be able to see that these would have formed sort of defensive berms just in case the Spanish ever did reach, although these disastrous battles marked the end of any attempt by the Spanish to invade directly, and they opted instead to destabilize Georgia with Indian raids. And in the old cemetery here at Fort Frederica are the graves of Christian Gottlieb Pryber, who tried to unite all of the tribes of the southeast into one tribal confederation under a communistic order, as well as, very likely, the Spanish who died in the battles of Gully Hole Creek and Bloody Marsh, along with the Indian allies of Oglethorpe and men who just died of disease at the fort. Today, none of these graves are marked, but it's a fascinating echo of history in the deep marshes of the southeast. A friend actually just recently showed me this. So here is a bit of wall from the redoubt, and it looks like it divots back in a square here. But originally there would have been a wooden wall that connected at a sort of 45-degree angle there. Now if you're going to attack, you would rush in to the weak point in the wall here, and you would hop over into a gun pit, because I'm standing where a gun would have been, would have just shot down in there and killed you if a rush actually succeeded in hopping over that fence. And of course, this being a redoubt, and actually the 3 Spanish ships that were bombarding them were right there. And I believe these are the old barracks with the parade ground right next to it, and of course the battery right over there, which the main battle was fought at. And so this is actually contemporary with Fort Frederica. You can see that this would have been actually the entrance, but here would have been the sergeants, the corporals, lieutenants would have lived in here, the hospital would have been over there, more lieutenants over there, and on either side of the entrance you had captains, so kind of higher ranking officers at the time, and here would have been a general assembly area. So you can see it was pretty well defended as well, and a good deal removed from the redoubt over at Fort Frederica itself. You can imagine all the people that had to probably come here after the battle to the hospital.